All right, good morning, everyone. This is Kelly Dubé from Tetra Tech. I'm the moderator for this session, and with me is Adriana Burke, also from Tetra Tech. If you have any technical issues, please just let us know in the chat, and Adriana will swoop in to the rescue. And just a reminder to please make sure that you are muted, and we recommend having your cameras turned off to help with bandwidth issues. Feel free to put any questions you may have for our presenter into the chat, and we will leave time at the end of the presentation to get to them. Feel free to use your emojis to give some feedback that won't interrupt the flow of the presentation. And just a reminder that our presenter is here today as a volunteer, and we're very grateful for the time taken out of everyone's busy day to have Jerry here to present, and then all of you here to listen. And just a reminder that anything shared today in terms of approaches or technology isn't necessarily endorsed by EPA or PADEP. The day is really here to be an exchange of information based on professional experience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry Northridge from College Township to talk about 1 joint PRP and 6 individual permits. Thanks so much, Jerry, for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Northridge. I am the assistant engineer for College Township and the engineer for Harris Township. So 2 of the municipalities in the State College region. I would say that this area works very well together. And so we're going to walk through the history and how that relationship continues. The MS4 partners, we have 7, and I'll touch base on this here and why we only have 6 permits. The MS4 partners, if you can picture the Burroughs State College and Penn State University at the center of the wheel, College Township lies to the east, Harris Township to the south, Ferguson Township south and west, and Patton Township to the north. In April of 2019, Spring Township joined as the 7th MS4 partner. They're further to the east towards Bellefonte. So they also participate in some of our sharing activity. The representatives of the MS4, Ron Seibert and Jasmine Fields, I believe, are on the call today. So Ron and Jasmine, if you have any comments, or feel free to jump in at any point if you have anything further to add. Steve Kaysen from Patton Township, I believe, intended to be on the call. He's bouncing back and forth between here and Leadership Center County. And Larry Fennessy from Penn State is managing the groundwater conference today. Each of these members that's on here, I'll say, has a public works township engineer role. We're involved not just with the MS4, but with local traffic, with local paving projects, and all public works aspects of the region. So we do communicate frequently, and frequent communication is necessary for these types of relationships to be successful. At a minimum, I know we get together on a Zoom now every other month. When we were meeting in person through various committees, I believe everybody saw each other about once a month. So maintaining open lines of communication and meeting regularly with your teammates is an important aspect to how this joint PRP and our joint relationship works. So in the beginning, the original 6 partners received their first MS4 permits back in 2003. If anybody on this call has had a permit that long, you remember that the first permits were just a warm, fuzzy hug. Let's talk about stormwater. Let's do public outreach, public education. Let's get people involved in recognizing stormwater exists and then recognizing how to keep it clean. So a shared website effort was set up with Clearwater Conservancy. We would do presentations throughout the region to first responders, realtors, other community groups as part of that public education and outreach process. And if any person, any group, or any municipality did those presentations to one of the regional groups, it was shared such that all of the regional groups were partaking in that credit as part of that permit compliance. Regional Watershed Cleanup Day is also organized by Clearwater Conservancy. We do some MS4 outreach relative to that. They help coordinate sites and volunteers, and it's part of the recognition of our environmental resources and protection. Spring Township, our seventh partner, they received their initial permit in 2019. They have a standalone PRP for this round of the process because they started later than the rest of the group, and they have a much smaller urbanized area that they were required to address. So they are on an individual permit, and they will share in the shared website and community outreach that Clearwater performs and the website maintained by the MS4 partners. So they indicate on their annual report, and we include them in those activities so that those aspects are addressed, but then their specific PRP and their specific projects are Spring Township exclusive. So for the balance of this presentation, we're going to focus on the original six, how that relationship of the original six evolved through 2003 up through the PRP process. So in the early roles, 2003, 2008, 2009, individual permittees were responsible for their own mapping, responsible for their own illicit discharge detection. Clearwater Conservancy, as the environmental group, the partner of each municipality, they hosted the website. Earth Day activities I have on here, that's the regional watershed cleanup, rain barrel workshops. They were kind of the clearinghouse for public education and outreach. The Conservation District in Center County has managed construction enforcement all along, and they are the primary recipient for complaint processing and tracking. And then overlapping responsibilities, these outreach and education portions, as I said, each of the municipalities would share in that effort so that we weren't being redundant, speaking to the same group, College Township 1 month speaking to a group, and then Harris Township showing up a separate month and giving a similar outreach opportunity, but overly redundant to the recipient. So through the first 3 permit cycles, everything's working well. Everybody's cooperating. The public outreach is going smoothly. And then the PRP. PRP for the center region was going to be due in November 2017. So March 2016, the idea of the PRP and the initial training rolls out from DEP. This is when everybody started getting their letters. You're going to have a TMDL, you're going to have this, you're going to have that. Here's your targeted pollutant reduction. So 2016, the trainings roll out, and October 2016, an RFP was drafted between the MS4 partners to seek an outside consultant to assist with development of a PRP. All of the individual permits at this point are staggered as far as when they're due. So there was open conversation with DEP to say, in order to align these permits and align with a joint PRP, what is the process? And so DEP's response was Penn State, being the earliest, would have to hit their deadline for submission November 2017, but DEP would then, in a sense, hold any issuance of permits until the joint PRP effort could be reviewed. So again, open communication, letting people know what you're doing, what your intent is. It meets that DEP goal of collaborative effort and coordination, reducing redundancy, and it's a win-win for everybody involved. Starting in October 2016, that gave over a year to develop the PRP, the effort to get a quality product. And ultimately, NTM was the chosen consultant. This is a slide from their public notice when we had to advertise the PRP. So the analysis would be to determine the planning area and then parse non-applicable areas. We'll come back to this, but the State College area has several areas where surface flow goes to groundwater, and under the MS4 training, surface flow to groundwater was deemed an area that could be parsed, and so that was the original intent of the PRP. The original pollutant load was established using map sheds, and the university had USGS gauges and model calibration that Big Hollow, Spring Creek, this map shed model could be calibrated to actual field data. And then from there, some of the larger BMPs in the area, credits were established for those existing BMPs. Load reductions were established, and then primary BMPs were identified for each individual permittee to meet their reduction goal. The cost of the PRP development were based upon urbanized areas. So I believe Ferguson is the largest, I believe Harris was the smallest, and that urbanized area proration determined what percentage each municipality or partner, I keep using the term municipality, Penn State University has their own MS4, and they participated as a cost-sharing partner. Modeling was completed by NTM. Region-specific conditions were incorporated. They were aware of the sinkholes, they're aware of the losing streams in the area, they had the calibrated information, and then proposed BMPs were developed. These proposed BMPs early on were the conversations, cost sharing, O&M. It was an important piece of this that everybody understand who's paying for what and that those ideas get memorialized in the PRP. One of the other steps that NTM did was to be very thorough in addressing both primary and secondary projects. So at this point, each of the partners has a list of what needs done to be compliant with their 10% reduction, but we also have a very thorough head start on the next permitting cycle, and we know what target areas are worth investigating for additional BMPs as this process moves forward. And then cost sharing where appropriate. There were a couple projects where cost sharing was involved, and that cost sharing was openly discussed and addressed early in the process, and is actually listed in the PRP. So across the center region, 9 primary capital projects are on here. The takeaway from this is not the individual projects, but the far right slide. The projects were identified such that each person is still an individual permit. So each individual permit is responsible for their own projects, for their own compliance, for their own installation, for their own O&M. And a majority of the projects identified would be specific to one partner, such that the joint effort of searching the region was performed under a collaborative effort, but individual compliance remains the responsibility of each permittee. No one municipality can be drawn into non-compliance by another permittee. Each person is responsible for their own. And then, as I mentioned, there's a series of secondary projects that were identified, another 9 projects from a similar nature, where each of these projects has been identified almost specifically to an individual permittee, with one unique cost-sharing venture on this list. In order to use these projects, it's unclear whether we have to go back through the DEP public advertisement since they're already in there. But as I said, at least for the next permit cycle, it's very clear that we have a head start. So the 6 partners, we developed this PRP, we go through the public advertising process, MapSheds is utilized to parse out the areas to sinkholes and groundwater. And the comments back from DEP were to conduct a hydraulic connectivity study to determine whether these truly went to groundwater or whether the pollutant load would resurface in a nearby area through these sinkhole spring combinations. This was a curveball to the group. When DEP issued these draft permits, we had 30 days to respond to the draft permit, and so it was meetings between the core group, taking the results of those meetings back to our elected officials and supervisors, and then kind of addressing the what ifs of where to go. Would we appeal this? Would we accept this connectivity study? And ultimately, what you see in front of you is a list of 8 areas that were originally parsed. And so these areas that go to groundwater were reinstituted back into the PRP. They were no longer parsed. Our comment within the 30-day window back to DEP was, rather than attempt to conduct a study which may or may not be conclusive. And based upon our experience in the center region with the number of studies that have already been performed, it was unlikely that we would have conclusive outputs within a permit cycle. So rather than go through the expensive studies and debating whether the studies had been thorough enough to prove the negative, all these sinkholes were added back into the PRP. So this adjusted everybody's contributory area. This adjusted the pollutant loads, but it removed that burdensome connectivity study. The partners had met to discuss. I could tell you that there were different opinions on how to address the DEP study, whether to appeal it, whether to accept it, whether to request the revision. But ultimately, the joint decision between everybody through that open and honest conversation was very important to advancing this process. So again, the risk of legal fees, the risk of not being able to complete this study, the partners ended up going back to DEP and saying, let us redraft the PRP, let us put these parsed areas back in. I believe in this next slide, I use the term unparse. So right now, under the version that's before DEP, PennDOT roadways are the only area that has been parsed out. Some of the secondary projects that had been identified by NTM were promoted to primary projects to compensate for the added load. So going that extra mile early on to be thorough in what we were searching for had an immediate payoff when we hit this speed bump. And then September 2019, we were re-advertising and resubmitted to DEP December 2019. March 2020, we received the redraft of all 6 permits to now be coordinated and on the same schedules to coordinate with the joint PRP. And July 1st, all 6 individual permits were issued. And so now they all have, while they remain individual permits, they all have identical dates as coordinated through DEP so that the joint PRP is effective in parallel to the dates in each of the 6 permits. That's a lot of information. Questions that you may have at this point?
Thanks, Jerry. So folks, if you do have questions for Jerry, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I have a few questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
First of all, I just have to chuckle at your characterization of the 2003 DEP permit for MS4s. I worked on that when RB Patel was with DEP, and it was a warm and fuzzy version of the permit. And clearly, you know, it's through the cycles of subsequent permits definitely become more technically challenging. I had a question on the parsing. Based on your experience then, what advice would you give to other municipalities that are looking to do a parsing? Do you feel like those studies have to be in place before they go through that process? I mean, is that the recommendation, or is the recommendation like to limit the number of areas you might parse because of DEP coming back with that type of request?
I could give a very loaded answer to how I feel about the situation.
Be nice.
So, yes. So I feel like if you are in a community where parsing could be questionable, have that conversation early with DEP. One of the primary takeaways I have from this process is that open communication throughout the process is important with each other, with DEP, with your long-term goals. So if there are areas that you feel should be parsed, and when you sat through the training, it fell into somewhat of a gray area, I would be open and honest with DEP about, before we expend the money and commit to this final version of the plan, what are the intermediate steps here, and how would you make this interpretation?
I think that's a really good point. And is that not part of the process already? I mean, does DEP offer the opportunity to sit down with municipalities early on in the PRP planning process?
I believe the initial release of what a PRP needed to be and what it needed to include has some very tight timeframes on it. And so not every community, and remember that the center region, we've had these permits since 2003. Each community has professional staff. But as some of these smaller communities, I can think of a few that were in the North Central region. Some of these smaller communities rely on outside consultants for everything. They don't have professional staff readily available, and it's not a familiar topic to them. This was brand new when the PRPs came out for many current permit holders. So as you have questions, yes, reach out, try to get that information. I've found that DEP is always willing to offer that guidance. You may disagree with that guidance from time to time, but they are available as a resource. And when you have a world of gray, it's worth to have those conversations early and often.
I think that's good advice. So now we have another question that popped up in the chat. How was it partnering with your neighboring municipalities? Were there good relationships to start, or did you have to struggle with strained relationships and overcome challenges there?
I'll let Ron jump in on this. My takeaway is that the core group, these five, six entities that work together, have a healthy relationship. But when we have to go talk to the elected officials about money, that always changes things. Everybody always has a different opinion. So, Ron, I hear you chuckling.
Yep.
You want to jump in?
Yep, I'll jump in, sure. And I think what Jerry said early on is we do have a healthy relationship because we work. I mean, State College area is not that big of a city. We don't even call ourselves a city. We're a community. And so we have a lot of overlap, and we do a lot of joint stuff together outside of stormwater, even where we'll do just kind of, we'll call it back scratching. If somebody needs a hand, one municipality will offer a hand in a disaster or a problematic with traffic signals or drainage or, borrowing equipment, whatever it is. So particularly at the staff level, there's a lot of good relationship and camaraderie amongst the 6 partners and the 5 municipalities. Once the higher up you go, of course, as you get to the managerial level or to the elected officials, sometimes there can be a little more friction. But I think the fact that we have that staff that works so well together, that we can come together, the 6 of us, and meet and discuss and resolve things and then present them back in a unified manner, goes a long way in how well we do work together. So the relationships are good. They were there. That's not to say that there weren't challenges or issues that had to be resolved or debated. But I think another point that Jerry made the other day when was pulling this presentation together is there is a healthy respect that we have for each other, right? We may not agree on everything all the time, but we'll understand the other person's perspective, and we respect that as we work towards resolving our conflicts or our problems. That even played out even just in the selection of a consultant, right? Everyone's got their own opinion as to who the better consultant perhaps is. So when we went into this consultant selection process, we came up with the RFP, and we agreed on what the specific criteria were going to be, what was important with the selection of that consultant, and how we were going to weight them. And then every partner had the opportunity to score them individually. And then we consolidated all those scorings into a composite score that averaged out all of them for the 6 partners till we came up with a selection. So even in that process, there was some discussion, open dialogue, resolution as to what we thought until we ultimately selected who the consultant was going to be. So same with the discussions on how we were going to split the cost share up, right? Was it going to be based upon impervious area, urbanized area? What was it? So all of that was good dialogue amongst the partners, the representatives, to come up with a solution that we would then take back to our administration and elected officials. So that collaborative at the staff level really, really pays off moving forward.
That's a great perspective. So I see another question popping up. How do you manage working with PennDOT? This participant saw them listed on the chart and wanted to know what sort of role they had in the PRP process.
To the best of my knowledge, they have had no role in the PRP process. So PennDOT early on has been parsed out, and they are responsible for their area.
Yep, that's correct.
Were they at the table during the parsing?
No.
No, and I believe I saw Jamie in the room earlier. Jamie, is PennDOT, is their MS4 permit finalized at this point on what their specific requirements actually are, or are they still at that development stage?
Their permit is close to being finalized. It just went out for well, we got public comments back. So we've been discussing a couple minor things, but yeah, PennDOT has their own permit. So municipalities have that option. They can parse all of PennDOT out because it's covered by a separate permit. And the same thing goes with the Turnpike.
Thank you. And so I believe, knowing what I knew then in 2016, 2017, the timelines for the municipalities as existing permit holders to get their renewals in and to begin this process was not well aligned with PennDOT's requirements. And so just that difference in timelines, it makes sense that they're still in development.
Great. So another question about having a university as one of your partners. Is that helpful? And does your collective group tap into the university for things like research and student interns and maybe some other resources?
We work with the university on so yes, there are resources that are available in the center region. We talked about some stream gauging and stream monitoring and the calibration of our model. So there are unique things that are available, but largely we're working with the physical staff, the folks on the ground doing the construction. We're not in the academic level with the MS4 program. So Dr. Fennessy is, of course, very well knowledged in stormwater and in the process and in the MS4 world. So he is one of our core group, but his role at the university is with the more physical nature of it, not the academic side.
And then I'd like to add a bit. The borough does partner with Penn State University. We have a Sustainable Communities Collaborative, and we do often tap engineering classes that maybe have senior capstone with the support of the professor to assist us with some of our projects, maybe some basic design, but of course, it ultimately needs to be approved by the borough engineer. But we do like to be able to use our facilities as a classroom or as a learning experience, being that the university is so close to the borough.
Thank you, Jefferson.
Yep.
Okay, so another question. You guys are generating lots of good questions. This is a very chatty group. I love it. Please explain how a BMP project that involves several municipalities is implemented and operated, and then there's a follow-on to that. Did you assign a leader or manage with a group to keep the process moving and facilitate all the communications that were critical to joint success?
So the short answer is yes. So for the Duck Pond project lies on Penn State property. And so Larry Fennessy would be the leader of that project on Penn State property. And he would be the director. And then in the end, capital contributions would come from the municipalities in exchange for those credits. The Fish and Wildlife Service project we discussed yesterday in a breakout session back in Hauserville. That's on College Township property, and that's a cost share between College and Harris for the long-term O&M of that facility. And so in that situation, College takes the lead and Harris is a financial supporter.
Yep. Kind of a tag on to Sean's question there about the managing the group. When we were going through the actual PRP plan development, once we selected the consultant, it was really the consultant that did the dialogue with DEP. Each of the individual partners didn't have as much direct dialogue. We would let the consultant submit it and respond. Even our public comment period was moderated by our consultant. All the partners were there to help answer questions, but it was really the consultant that kind of took the lead in facilitating the whole plan development. So that seemed to be a well way to work with that.
Okay, great. Any other questions from the group? Oh, yes, there is. Let's see. It says, were sediment load reduction credits divided up by level of monetary investments? Oops, I lost the note. Yeah, by monetary investment by partner.
I guess to re-clarify the question. As an individual permittee holder, each person has their own assigned sediment load. And so therefore, the BMPs necessary to reduce their sediment load are financially applied to each individual partner. We are not cost sharing between partners to reduce anyone else's sediment load.
Okay, so hopefully that clarifies it for the question asker. Anything else? All right, that was a clear answer.
All right.
Well, I think this is a challenging and fascinating exercise in, collaboration and being able to, create and leverage these synergies in order to, like you said, individually comply, but still achieve a watershed goal. So I think Pennsylvania's approach to this is fascinating, and the way that you're implementing it seems to be a great case study for municipalities throughout Pennsylvania. So I guess if there are no other questions, let's use our applause button to show our presenters some appreciation for their time and effort to be with us today and share this great information. And, obviously reach out to them if you have additional questions. It sounds like there's a lot of great lessons learned from their experience. So thank you so much, Jerry, and other folks involved in this effort, for taking the time to be here today. We really appreciate it. Our next session will begin shortly, so please make sure to leave this meeting and go back to your agenda and find the link for the next plenary, and we'll queue up the next set of breakout sessions. Thanks, everybody, for your time today. See you in the next session.